Well, before I start with the talk, I just want to get an introduction on who I am. My name is Jackson Berry. I've been making video games since I was about 12 years old. Then I went to college at USC with Jenny, actually, at the Ivan Young Academy, where I also studied video games. From there, I started a startup and went into Y Combinator, which is like a startup incubator in San Francisco. Sold that, and then a few years post that, I started a new video game studio called Communion Games, where we're working on games that are somewhere in between civic design and game design. Current game is called Yellow Era. I'll talk about it later. My talk is about virtual heterotopias, which is expanding on Foucault's idea of the heterotopia, which is adjacent to utopia, but is the idea of creating a world, a space, or a piece of art that shows off a different way of living or a different way of understanding reality, and expanding on that to understand how video games can do this in a very unique and novel way, and how video games are different than most mediums in which this has been attempted so far. So to start with that, I want to talk about my understanding of how video games work over my career. The basis of this understanding for me evolves actually from Tarkovsky's idea of film, which was he laid out in his memoir, Sculpting in Time. His idea is that film is the art of time, and that creating film can change the way people perceive reality, and their own understandings of themselves and their perceptions of reality around them. I believe that video games are sculpting in action, where most mediums are, I perceive to be nouns. They are encapsulate some sort of feeling or idea. Video games are an active medium, that their meaning comes from participation with the medium of itself. In that way, it's a bit of an embodied ideology where a great designer can take a meaning and they can have players play it out and experience and live that meaning for themselves. And the person I want to first talk about is funny. It's actually Elden Ring. I'm not going to go as deep as the last talk did, but more into like the foundation of how Elden Ring came to be. Miyazaki, the original creator, I don't know if any of you have ever played Elden Ring, but it's a very, very difficult game. And people tend to think that Miyazaki was a bit of a sadist because he puts his players through so much pain. But in an interview, somebody asked him that, and he said he's actually a masochist. And he creates games because he wants to experience pain and he enjoys that suffering. And if you look at the design of a game like Elden Ring or any of the Soul series before, you can see that. The game from the top to the bottom is all about experiencing suffering and overcoming suffering. From the world that's designed around it to the gameplay itself, it's all about that core feeling. So I would consider it sculpting with the verb or the action. The next game I was going to talk about is Journey. Genova Chen was very important in my journey as a game designer. He started, his first game was called Flow, which was an experiment in getting players to feel the feeling of flow. And since then, he's expanded his breadth of games into just diving deep into that feeling. So in a way, his actual practice is sculpting with that feeling of flow. There's a worse side of that as well. Whereas if you can design from an emotion or from a feeling, you can also use things that are generally not as productive. I think the most well understood version of this is loot boxes and free-to-play models of games, which are creating systems and actions of addiction. The purpose is profiteering off of the users. And it's become a problem that I think is reaching its climax in metaverses. I wrote Game Design Heresy. Looking at that now, it's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but the current state of metaverses, I think, is very pernicious to talking about what it means to design a game that can actually show new ways of being, because metaverses are essentially the opposite. They take parts of reality that we already have, which are generally just some sort of profit motive, some sort of late capital system, and they create it into a virtual world and expect people to go in there and enjoy it. And it's generally not working, but the way I'm going to structure this talk is talking about the difference between metaverses and the way a heterotopia could be used to do essentially the opposite of what they are. So I'd say the metaverse is the evil twin of a virtual heterotopia. So talking about that, one of the core reasons that I think that a metaverse does not work in the current way that they understand it is that the foundation often contradicts the whole of what they're trying to say it is. Like if you say it's a reality that people can live in and they can be free and they can enjoy themselves and do whatever, and that the purpose that Fortnite generally says outwardly about their metaverse attempts is to bring people together. But when the overall message is community and the actual foundational action is shooting each other, you can't really build a community, which is what I got about the sculpting aspect earlier, is that the very foundation of the game needs to be synonymous with the message of the game and the overall purpose of the game. And if the main interaction of the game is violence and their overall purpose of the game is community, it just doesn't work. So if you want to actually build a heterotopia that can teach people like new ways of interacting with people in a way that I believe games are capable of doing, then you have to start from the bottom. You have to start from interactions that actually build community. One of the best examples of which I think is Human Fall Flat, which is a game it's a physics-based game where you essentially just carry physics objects to solve puzzles with up to 20 players. It's a very good community experience. Second part, which I alluded to earlier, is that if you want people to exist within a world and you want to create a world that is novel and can help people understand new ways of being, then you shouldn't recreate the things that people are already trying to escape within the reality. One example of this is a game that I've tested recently called Seed, which claims to be a new reality for people to experience and to essentially be a heterotopia or a simulated utopia of a new type of reality. But the only systems that they allow people to recreate is late stage market capitalism. And I don't think there's that much interest in players and working jobs when that's already what they do with their day. Here's Ursula Le Guin, who is a big inspiration of mine in game design. And I think what she did specifically with the Hainer cycle and the Dispossessed is an incredible example of what video games could also achieve, but in a different way. She created lived-in possibilities of worlds, of different worlds that have totally unique rules that allow us to imagine what life could be like. I think games can do this in an even more powerful way because you actually get to live them. You don't just hear the story. You don't just imagine the possibilities. You could exist within those worlds. And from that, understand how to change the world itself. But you can't do that if you get stuck inside of the simulation, inside of the reality. A lot of the metaverses are just trying to create essentially the matrix where it's you live in there for the rest of your life. They try to addict people to be playing it 10 to 12 hours a day. And I don't think that's the way to do it. I don't think that you can ever actually recreate reality. I don't think that we're ever going to make a virtual world that's as good as the world we actually have. And I think in doing that and getting people addicted to that, then you keep them out of improving the world that we exist in. I think the better way to go about it is to prototype it instead. Simulating is trying to actually recreate a world for people to exist in. Prototyping is just creating an imagination of what a new world could look like so that people can jump in and experience it. So overall, those are like the main points that I think are important to creating a heterotopia and to creating a world that people can go in, they can see new possibilities, they can get out and actually make it happen. And I think this is already happening. I think there's the bad side of it, which is metaverses, but I think there's a really good side of it. And I think the best example of that is Sky, Children of the Light, which is the kind of magnum opus of Genova Chin, who created Flow and created Journey. And this game is expanding on his idea of flow to try to create a community, an entire world that is based on the concept of flow and based on connecting in that way. It's absolutely worth playing. It's an incredible game. And even though that game's already being made, I think there's a lot more we need to do. I think this is something that a lot of people, especially Black directors in Hollywood, have started interacting with. I think Black Panther, Atlanta, and a lot of Jordan Peele's work do this. They create alternate realities that allow people to experience and understand what their community could have been and what they could been or could be. I think Black Panther is an absolutely incredible example of what that looks like. But I think there's more to be done. And I think, well, films, once again, they show what it could look like. They don't actually show what it's like to exist within that. And I think creating a really true to its core game that expresses what Black Panther is, what it means to live in that society, not just what it means to be a superhero, would have a much bigger impact on people's understanding of civic imagination and the way that they can change their world into something new. I think creating the dispossessed into a virtual world could also be a great way of doing that. And that's my talk. Thank you. Also, to add on to the end of that, I'm in Wyoming, so I have not really been able to watch y'all's talks, but I really want to talk with you and I want to hear more people's ideas around this space. So please contact me, reach out. I'll go and watch y'all's talks on the YouTube recording and message you. But if you're interested in what I said, please shoot me a message.
I think there's three positions that you presented towards prototyping gameplay, and then one is the sort of masochistic, the sculpting masochism of the Elder Ring series. The other is what maybe just the opposite, which is the attempt to recreate the world in a kind of addictive loop in metaverse. And the third you represent is this prototyping heterotopias. And I think that heterotopia is another world that is different from our world that allows us to try to explore those differences in a felicitous way and maybe to sort of discover ways that our world can be better in comparison to it. And would you say that it's significantly different from, or it escapes from some of the negative loops of the two alternatives? On the one hand, smoking masochism, the other hand, one that is sort of factors in feedback. So I guess my question is this: how would you, on the one hand, not sort of have the gameplay pivot upon the counter with and the overcoming of suffering on the one hand, or being simply drawn along by sort of pre-programmed lures that always sort of incentivize your desire?
Yeah, I mean, I think examples all over the place in game design of ways to do things without relying on like a dopamine rush. I actually think Zelda's new Tears of the Kingdom is a really good example of this. There's obviously the dopamine built in and the patterns of, hey, you have to go save the princess and do all that. But what people have been most interested in that game has just been essentially engineering. They have like a really open system of ways to craft devices. And in that, I think they allow people to explore like what it means to create things, like physical things, without any sense of like, oh, I just need to like keep overcoming this and going in that loop. It's a very open and creative loop. I think Minecraft is a similar thing. Minecraft doesn't really have an end goal. It doesn't really have like suffering that you need to continually overcome. It's just an open-ended world where you can do what you want to do. And there are different places where that's set into it, but I think generally allowing the player more complexity and building a world that they can live within instead of just needing to jog towards certain goals allows for that.
Olivia.
Oh yeah, I really loved this presentation. First of all, I've done work with AR and VR, and I definitely share your disappointment with kind of how that's evolved as opposed to what it could be.
Yeah,
I really like how you articulated that. I wanted to touch on the one point you made, which is you shouldn't recreate the things that people are already trying to escape in their reality. And I wanted to kind of bring up a question about how that relates to good design for virtual reality and augmented reality. Because in my work with AR and VR, I kind of like through doing research and testing, I came to the conclusion that like embodied design is probably the most intuitive thing you can do, which is creating interfaces that resemble objects that people are familiar with in the real world. Because those are, you know, people kind of intuitively know how to interact with those things in 3D space. And so I was curious, like, what are your thoughts on finding that balance between like familiarity that enables people to be able to interact with things easily versus, you know, imagining new possibilities in that space?
That was a great question. I think it takes time, honestly. I think you're right to recognize that like you have to meet people where they're at, you know. If you make something that's so far in the future and so far away from what people actually understand, you know, then they're not going to connect to it. I don't know if I want to bring Kanye's name into this, but he, before he went off the rails, he had a really good quote where he was like, if you want to change society, you have to think of yourself as a lever, and a lever needs to be just outside of the cultural norm. If you're too far away, you don't get any leverage and you can't actually change things. So you have to be like right there in order to move it. And I think that's what I tend to look for. I try to ground it in the familiar and what works and what people understand, and then just go a step beyond that and start moving people in that direction. On the other side of that, I also think there's a difference between mechanics and world design. I think mechanics generally do need to be very close to what people are familiar with. When you change mechanics, people just get frustrated and they leave. And I think what you're doing in VR is the right way to go about it. Like physically, you need to do things that people understand. But world building, you can go a little bit farther off the rails without confusing people, you know, especially in video games. People are used to surrealism, they're used to fantasy, they're used to sci-fi. Like, I think you can do that without scaring people off too quick.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any other question?
Yeah, that was a really great talk. Thank you, Jackson. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
And then I actually talked about flow in my talk in relation to social media. So I was wondering, this idea of like more complexity and not just goals is really familiar from theory of flow. But I wondered if you would ever think about applying that kind of theory, not just to games, but to kind of like social media, or maybe you actually see games as a better form of social media. So think about that dynamic. And then secondly, would kind of making money or career or something like that ever be a part of that, or gaming is very divorced from that? Obviously, gaming, but
yeah, I mean, that's a perfect question for me. My company in college actually was trying to like develop a more collaborative social media company. So yeah, I do think there's absolutely possibilities within the social media space to improve the way people interact. I actually think TikTok has been a really good step in the right direction in a lot of ways. It has a lot of collaborative features. It has a lot of different ways for people to like interact with community. I think the feed breaks it up a lot in a way that's harmful, so that like communities never actually form. But there are mechanics within TikTok that I think are worth examining, especially the replies, especially the duets, that allow people to like actually interact with each other more. Could you rephrase the second question a bit? I don't think I totally understood it.
I suppose I'm interested in this kind of phenomenon of influencers, and even on a kind of more mundane level. In my talk, I asked people if they, use social media, and then actually if they monetized it, or if their career was kind of in any way on it, and pretty much everyone did put their hand up. So I'm wondering the idea of gamification or flow. Like, could that be applied to kind of somehow, making money, pursuing these higher values of like self-realization and career? Or is that a total corruption of the essence of this kind of principle?
I mean, that's a hard question. I think it's a great question as well. I generally don't tend to think that money corrupts like the truth and value of something, unless it's also manipulating like the way you're forced to interact with it. I think of this like on the spiritual sides of things. Like I'm opening a meditation retreat center right now, and we're going to be charging for it. And the way that like I've thought about that was Yogananda. I don't know if you ever read his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. But in it, he talks about when he moved to America, he was told by his teachers that he had to start charging for his lessons. And they told him that just because that's how the West understands value. Like, that's just how we are. That's how we've been for so many generations, that like you kind of need money associated with something in order for like people in the West to understand that it's valuable. And because of that, like I don't really see a problem with the monetization of enlightenment, if that's kind of what you're asking, or like the monetization of spiritual growth, or the monetization of, I mean, personal development. I think there's ways to bring it in that are useful. And I think that systems of addiction, the opposite side of them is systems of enlightenment. You know, like a system of addiction is a way to get people trapped inside of just like this tight little ball. And if you reverse that and you unwind it, that's what enlightenment is. Like enlightenment is the process of unlearning something. And I think there's a way to gamify that. I really do. It's something I've tried to do for a long time. It's very difficult, but I think it's a path worth pursuing. And I think there's a lot of ancient paths that already do it. I think Buddhism has already figured out a way to do like a step-by-step process to unlearn reality and to learn their metaphysics. And I don't think there's anything wrong with like really attaching game systems to that. I just think you have to be really, really mindful of the way in which you do it.
Thank you so much. I definitely want to talk more about this topic sometime.
Yeah, please. Absolutely. Message me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jackson.
Yeah, thank you. Y'all have a good one.